Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me, I have a newcomer into the temple, creator of the Runecaster RPG, which managed to do absolute gangbusters on Kickstarter, funding in about 2 hours. We probably would have done this during the crowdfund if it weren't for timing. The one and only Wesley Zebrowski. I'm hoping I got that pronounced right.
Yeah, technically no, but I also pronounce it wrong, so do not worry about it whatsoever.
Yeah, I try my best to get pronunciation as right as I can. Try being the operative word here.
Oh, it's all good. I teach students, and so I often get their names wrong, so I get it on both ends, don't worry.
Don't even get me started on Polish names.
Oh, I know.
If any of you students are Polish or Eastern Europe, or in that part of like Eastern Europe, or have family from that part of the world, then you know the pain. Because no matter what you do, you will screw it up.
Yeah, you just have to embrace it, and then you pretend like, I'll get it better next time, and maybe you get like 10% better, and it's a slow learning process,
I refer to the definition of insanity.
Sure.
Also known as being a Mets fan.
Luckily, I'm able to steer clear of baseball, so I can avoid the Mets slander.
Well, if I could have said being a Brewers fan. They seem to find a way to blow it every time.
I think it's probably been like 10 years since I've been to a Brewers game, so I can join you in criticizing them. Sure.
Yeah, I follow that kind of thing for the memes and to roast teams that find interesting ways to screw up.
Sure.
But one of the traditions around here is opening with the humble beginnings, in a sense. So, with that said, I'd like you to walk me through your introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
Oh, that is a good question. So, like I think a lot of people, my first game was, of course, Dungeons & Dragons. I got one of those, those box starter kits with, little miniatures. And I remember in some of my first sessions, just, with a single friend, putting him through completely unrealistic encounters. And it was awesome, and also, horribly unbalanced. And
Are we talking wipe sessions?
Sorry, what did you say?
Are you talking wipe sessions like TPK?
Oh, yeah. And, it was just, one player, and I was like, oh, you're level 2, here's, this massive golem. You can handle this. Of course, this is, middle school. I have no idea how the game works.
And in all fairness, nobody knows how things work their first time.
Yeah.
As the saying goes, oftentimes the first thing you do sucks.
Of course, yeah. I think I would think one of the first modules I then tried to run seriously. I mean, I did some homebrew stuff that was, just kids playing around, but I definitely accidentally ran oh man, I'm blanking. What's the super hard D&D 3.5 module?
Elemental Evil?
No, it was it's the one with the lich at the end. Man, I should remember the name of it.
Tomb of Horrors.
Tomb of Horrors, yes. I was I'm going to run my middle school friends through this. Not realizing it was one of the most notorious sessions ever. So that was my intro.
Well, do you know why Tomb of Horrors is so infamously much of a meat grinder?
Enlighten me.
It goes back to the early days of D&D, where Gygax's playtesters were saying to him that the modules he was putting them through were too easy. Which don't do that, people. If you do that, be prepared for the pounding you are going to get. It's like you are tempting the gods of irony to screw you.
Right.
And so I guess his mind says, all right, you think those were too? You think you want something hard, do you? You're gonna get something hard. Phrasing.
Yeah.
And I liken it to the Black Page. The composition by Frank Zappa, which is the most evil bit of sheet music I've ever seen in my life. And it was because some of the people in Zappa's band wanted more complex instrumentations. Be very, very careful what you wish for, because you might get it.
Yeah, I remember hearing stories of people going through that particular dungeon and like somehow surviving, and then just getting to the end and realizing they had no possible way to damage the boss. It's like, yeah, all that time wasted.
Yeah, I mean, they wanted something. They wanted something challenging. But I'm pretty sure you've heard something along this lines that sometimes the customer may quote unquote be always right, but sometimes the customer knows not what they ask for.
Oh, for sure. They probably needed to be guided to what will best satisfy their desires,
Mm-hmm. And when it comes, and I can, it's certainly not something that I would advise putting a rookie through.
No.
It would be like having someone learn to swim and then pushing them off the high dive.
Right, into like a very strong current pool, slowly circling the drain.
No, just throw them into the deep end and tell them swim. Damn it.
Sure.
Yeah. But with that said, did you largely stick with D&D, or did you experiment with other games in the years after 3rd edition?
Yeah, so I think I played a lot of D&D, but I never really loved it, I think. It was like, part of my contention was that, and I will obviously beat this drum today still, that like it never really focused on narrative. And so I found myself gradually kind of branching out over time. So maybe around the time I was like hitting college, I was of course participating in some like homebrews of different types of games in high school. And so kind of a classic game that we played was there's this I think pretty well-known game called Dawn of Worlds, which is just like collaborative world building for this big map. Oh, awesome. Okay, great. So we played a ton of that, and that was like my branch into non-D&D games.
Right. And I look at that whole thing you had mentioned about not quite being on board with D&D as a symptom of trying to treat one game as if it can handle everybody.
Right.
I'm not that one size fits all approach, which is akin to thinking that everybody likes Coca-Cola. I sure as hell don't. Or that because of all the variations of Coke that it's some Omni soda.
Mm-hmm.
I realize it's not the best example, but it's what comes to mind.
Sure.
Point is, one size fits all is a lie. Even when it comes to like clothing.
Yeah.
But given that Dawn of Worlds is a very collaborative, almost GM-less experience, from what I recall of it, was that one of the factors when it came to the inspirations for Runecaster?
So I think yes and no. It set me down like this very big tangential path, which led to the development of kind of the next game we want to push after a Runecaster. But I think the thing I took away from it, and that is very much present, is this idea of like collaborative flexibility. So there's like barely any rolling in Runecaster, and so it's about trying to go at different sides of the narrative. So it's like the player starts the narration and the GM finishes it. So it's kind of this push and pull as opposed to some other games which feel kind of more straight dictated. And so I think in all my games, I try to capture that feeling of kind of all being around the same thing, putting your fingers into it, building off each other's narratives. That's the kind of vibe I really like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, Runecaster obviously is themed around amateur magicians using different rune patterns to use spells. What prompted that particular direction, I guess?
Yeah, so I think weirdly enough, I like built the skeleton of the game in like 2017 or 2018 while I was like at a conference, and I had this tiny little notebook and I just started drawing runes, and I like came up with this whole system randomly. And then it like sat somewhere discarded in my house for like 5 years. And then Magic the Gathering's Strixhaven came out because I am too engaged with Magic the Gathering for my own good, and I loved that. Even though it's kind of like a furry reskin of Harry Potter, which I was never a huge fan of, but I just loved it, and so I wanted to play a game in that world. And then I realized, hey, I had this notebook full of discarded ideas, and I kind of put together Runecaster just as a way to have some sort of fun campaign.
I can get that. And with that in mind, when it comes to the inspiration list, the touchstone that you put in, I'd like to go through this list, skipping Strixhaven, of course, because you already mentioned that, and kind of get a feel for what about each of these touchstones served as an inspiration for what would become Runecaster. Starting with Lost Magic.
Yeah, so Lost Magic is, I think, objectively not a very good Nintendo DS game that I played as a kid. And the reason why it's an inspiration is because that game is forever stuck in my brain for some reason. You like use the Nintendo Switch stylus to draw different combinations of runes, which then made different spells, which is like kind of exactly how Runecaster works. Now, the game itself was not good in hindsight. I think like Wikipedia says it's got like 7 stars on average or something, and it was like horribly impossible to beat. But I love that game. It's just like this little person playing on this tiny tablet. And the bones of that game are very visible in just the base way you cast spells in Runecaster. And if anyone knows Lost Magic or has played it, you will immediately understand this.
Yeah, I could see it though. While looking at Lost Magic, I end up getting a false positive of a 2D MMO with the same name, so that's totally not confusing or anything.
Sure, yeah.
I will admit that its particular drawing a spell kind of setup. It's not my first rodeo with it. There was a lot of those kind of things in the early days of the DS because hey, there's a touchscreen, we should use it.
Yep.
But I will admit one of my early introductions to that was a PC RPG called Arx Fatalis. Though, putting aside the fact that that game was very strange, it was very much in the vein of Gothic. And the trying to draw spells with a mouse and keyboard was not exactly the most elegant solution. Um, but the obviously the next one is Strixhaven. Were you a heavy player of Magic the Gathering before, or did Strixhaven bring you in specifically?
Yeah, so I started with New Phyrexia, whenever that was. It's been a long time. And then I played for a while, and then, like a lot of Magic players, I got out of it because other things just happened in my life. I went to college, I didn't have a good game store that didn't smell like actual human waste, and I just kind of dropped out, and then at one point came back once suddenly it was digital and actually quality. I still love the game, but it's got a lot of baggage with it that is probably beyond the discourse of this discussion. But I love some of the worlds they've built, and I still like to try to run games in those worlds, or rather, I'm trying to at some point.
Mm-hmm. And I do hope you've never had to be in a situation where you end up playing against a sliver deck.
It's been a long time. I definitely have at some various points.
Then again, during the Mirrodin era, one of my decks was a rainbow deck that had a lot of cards that got stronger effects the more color types you used to cast.
Oh yeah.
Along with having a bunch of artifacts that kept pumping out 1/1 monsters, so I would just do a slow Zerg rush. People hated it.
My first real deck was like a mirror deck, and I loved that deck. It was not good, but I just got to play the big ball of mirrors, and I was like, "This is amazing! I love it. It's so good."
Yeah. My strategy was more often than not to build decks that I knew were toxic, just to mess with people. They weren't designed to win; they were just designed to drag something out until someone quits out of boredom.
Sure. The no win con type gameplay. I can respect it, honestly.
Yeah. Especially since I would do little side bets, like when the one chip challenge was a thing, that would be the wager. Whoever loses has to eat that chip. Or I got a Carolina Reaper once, and it was a case of loser has to eat it.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal. So lock him into a 2-hour game with the Reaper on the line.
Yeah, just have these sword of Damocles over them.
That's hilarious.
Because everybody's like, you can't do psychological warfare in Magic. I'm like, yes, I can.
Absolutely.
If I have absolutely zero morals, I can do it. But obviously, the next one on the list is Magicka, which I have played both the original and the sequel, and I can kind of guess one of the inspirations. Is it through the whole mix and match thing that Magicka had?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Just like obviously I don't need to explain it, but it's all about combining the different types of magic to produce different spells, and that's really kind of what's going on in this game. This game's obviously more flexible than Magic is by nature of Magicka being a video game and very arcadey and fast-paced. But that was kicking around in my brain when designing this. Now, Magicka, playing that game, like fundamentally overwhelms and hurts my brain, but I do still like it. I just can never get far because I get overwhelmed.
Yeah, there's usually a lot of arguing when I'm playing, because if I'm playing that, I'm playing it with buddies, and that involves a whole lot of arguing over who screwed up. But that's part of the fun for us.
Sure, yeah.
Since if you're getting 4 people together for any sort of co-op game, you should expect chaos.
Of course, which is how it's played best.
But obviously, the next one you had was Witch Hat Atelier. So I'm familiar with that as far as the manga, but what was it just the aesthetic of that particular manga that drew it to be a touchstone here?
Yeah, so this is definitely the most recent on the touchstone. So I'm actually not very far in Witch Hat. I've only read like the first 3 volumes. But the more I started to like appreciate it, the more I'm like, okay, this is similar to what's happening in the game. Obviously, the casting systems are very different, but I feel like they feel very spiritually similar, right? Like in the manga, you're playing, or the character and some of the side characters, are like these young, aspiring mages who are still failing all the time, figuring out how to do things, which is very much what's happening in the role-playing game, right? And I love in the manga the different, unique ways of drawing different runes and how that leads to different spells. And while that's not quite the same in the role-playing game, which is a whole other discussion over how you can or can't combine runes. I just felt like it made perfect sense to kind of list this as a touch point. Less because I have read the whole manga, although I'm slowly getting through it, but more because it's like, I think that helps orient someone looking at the game to get a better feel for what playing it's like.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. And the last being the name of the wind.
So, have you read this book first?
When I saw the name, I got thrown off, but I know it as the Kingkiller Chronicle.
Yes, yeah.
Now, in that regard, yes.
Yeah, probably saying Kingkiller Chronicles would have been more effective, although I don't think we're ever getting a third book.
We'll get a third book right after George R. R. Martin finishes The Winds of Winter.
Right. I'll be on my deathbed, someone will run in, and it'll be like, the third book's finally out. But I think, it's been a while since I read that book series, but I loved it dearly. And the thing that sticks in my brain, which makes its way into, like, the fabric of Runecaster, was just the whole arrow catch. And just, I loved the idea of inscribing all of these magical runes onto contraptions and, like, making essentially industrial appliances from it. And that, to me, is a huge part of how the world of Runecaster, which is, not strictly defined, would function. And I've fleshed that out more over time with, like, some certain characters, and the zine, which we're currently working on from the stretch goals, really talking about, like, how you use runes in different ways with contraptions or the environment to create new types of spells. And so really, the arrow catch is the touchstone, and then the Kingkiller Chronicles is, like, still relevant, right? But in my brain, that's how it's working.
Now, obviously, one of the big things about this particular game is the use of magic, and I believe you have it as a step of drawing up to 3 runes, invoking a conduit, invoking the character, invoking the reasoning, and then narrating the results. So, Given that, would it be fair of me to assume that this is a diceless game?
Yes, mostly. So the only time dice get pulled out is if you are taking a non-magical action to try to overcome the challenge the GM puts in front of you. So if the challenge is you have to get into this building, you have to get past the guards, sneak in, it's assumed you're going to use magic. If you want to, say, try to sneak in or convince the guards to let you in, that you belong in there, then we use kind of a pretty simple D6 roll system, and the assumption is you have to have some sort of skill. So your character might have, like, a diplomacy skill, or might be good at lockpicking. And in that case, we use a roll. But it's de-emphasized, right? Because we want to encourage the players to solve their problems with magic. Sometimes it might come up.
Yeah. Now, given that, I'm assuming that no matter what, every single spell that they could create is using those same 9 runes. Is that correct?
Yeah.
All right. Given that, what would really change if someone's using just a single rune for a thing? If they're using 2 or 3, not in terms of effect, but just in terms of, is there any major thing that changes from using more than one rune?
Yeah, so let's say, like, for example, you just use the smallest rune and you just use a heat rune. Well, you might start kind of a small fire, right? But if you add more and more and have 3 heat runes, you've now basically increased the intensity. So you can overlap the same rune to make things stronger. But that, is often putting you in peril if you don't read the situation right. If you make a massive fireball in an enclosed house, you're probably going to hurt yourself and your allies. So it's kind of that fun interplay between trying to find like the just right porridge of a spell.
Yeah. So I'd like to posit a few effects and pick your brain as to how those would be accomplished through combinations of runes.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, let's say that, because I'm assuming with all of these, this rune has to be applied onto an object. Is that correct?
So actually, there's a bunch of different ways you can do it, and it depends on your caster. So you could apply it on an object. You could cast it into the air. For example, one of the example conduits we give is our gloves, right? And so you can trace a rune onto your glove and then knock your gloves together, or make some signs with your hands and punch a spell into someone. So it really depends on like what your character is good with.
Yeah. So given that, let's say that somebody wants to have it put a rune on a coin so that no matter how many times it's flipped, the coin always lands heads.
Yeah, so I think what I would recommend is doing some combination of mending and force. So what I like about the runes is that they have both very metaphorical effects and also very literal effects. And so that gives the GM like a lot of ways to interact with it. And so they can create some unpredictability. So I would think if you did 2 spells and drew kind of a small mending and a small force, if you were good at doing so, you could use a force to make sure that there's always a little puff if the tails would land up to flip it over to heads. And I like the incorporation of mending to kind of direct it, right? Because it's always kind of rewinding it to that head state, or the part of the mending effect is to make right. And I like that implication that like the heads is the right outcome for the coin.
Mm-hmm. Now, if somebody wanted to put runes on say a pair of glasses that could allow the wearer to see in the dark, what would that end up being?
Yeah, that's also a good one. So I think when it comes to sight, I tend to use connection in the sense that so the description of connection is touches the mind, finds invisible ties, and tempts fate. And so connection kind of, in my brain at least, would kind of expand the sight a little bit. And then I'm actually a little unsure. I haven't thought too much about creation of light. I think part of what I like about the game too is that it really depends on who the GM is, how they want to make spells. And so while I say some connection glasses would let you see in the dark, not producing light, but see the world as it is, a different GM could be like, oh, well, we should make some mending glasses, and that does it. And so, like, different sessions by different people are going to produce different spells that do the same things with different combination of runes. And so, like, sorry, this is a tangent to cover for me not having the best answer to your spell, but is to say that, like, at the end of a campaign, you'll effectively have some spell book that was designed between the player and the GM. And that's going to be very different from when I ran the game.
Yeah, and obviously, with a lot of these spells. These are just a few examples I just wanted to throw out there. But
Yeah.
when it comes to conduits, which is the means that you use to cast a given spell, obviously there's narrative changes, but mechanically, is it more about how it's used in the story that determines how a conduit is going to play a factor into something?
Yeah, so I think the story is always really important. And part that's because, or rather, I kind of wrote that into the way spells are resolved. So when you cast a spell, you kind of decide what your character is thinking about as they cast it. Are they using a lot of logic? Are they kind of using a lot of emotion? Or are they using automatopoeia, so are they just like shouting something? And I think of those as playing into the narrative differently. So if you're very logical, maybe the narrative arc is a little less important because you're just thinking about the mechanics of how things work. But if you're casting spells more with emotions, then maybe it reflects more like what ought to happen in the narrative. And the conduits themselves, we list a bunch of examples in the book. I think it's good to define ahead of time how those conduits work differently than different ones. So, for example, if you use a charm, charms are all about like casting spells through the environment. So someone's much more connected to the space around them, whereas like a wand is very directed. It's very pointed. You can shoot things from the end of it. And I like that because it also better reflects how those characters cast things differently. And so if you cast the same runes on a knife versus off a wand, you can get different effects. And I think that lets players have more agency in terms of like their style of casting, even though there's only 9 runes.
Yeah, I can get that, but you also have the notion of quick casting.
Yes.
What would be the benefits and drawbacks of that?
Yeah, so I think quick casting is great for when you are feeling overwhelmed, which is just going to happen whenever you play any role-playing game. It's like your tried and true bread and butter spell that you always know how it's going to work. Now, it's not always going to solve your problem, but sometimes what you need is just something reliable to happen. And maybe it helps a little bit, maybe it hurts a little bit, but you're not going to blow yourself up when you do your quick cast. And they also double, I think, by giving characters a bit more identity, because they're spells that they are proficient with, but also like identify with. So one of the characters, their quick cast is creating this living sculpture that they have had a relationship with for their entire time casting magic. And so it's like bringing in this extra character that's very emblematic of what that character likes to do in their relationship to magic. So that's fairly deep, but you know, another character's quick cast is literally just throwing like corrupted coins at people, which is very thematic for their character, but you know, not so deep as I'm going to summon my best friend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can get that. Now, with that in mind, when it comes to people just improving as casters, how is that reflected within the system?
Yeah, so when people make their characters, they select 2 of the 9 runes that they have an affinity with. So those are the runes they know how to cast. And then they select one they have a negative affinity with. So like that's the rune that they are bad with. And so, you know, it gives some characters some strengths and weaknesses. So when they use spells that they're good with, or runes they're good with, then their spells are more effective. And when they use the one they're bad with, then they're less effective, which could put some characters into a bind. So if you're not good at connection, then you're not going to be able to cast spells that like read people's minds or talk to people across distances well. And then that gives those characters kind of an opportunity to improve over time. So the way we design progression is at the end of a session, or maybe mid-session if it makes sense, basically a character gets to choose kind of a slow upgrade. So they could gain another affinity to show that they have developed their skills as a mage, right? They've gained mastery over another rune. Or they could remove a weakness, right? They've worked on their weakness, and they can now cast spells effectively that use that rune. And all of these choices are supposed to come from kind of the culmination of your experiences. And the way we do that, ideally, is with like a note system. So when you like cast a spell, you take a little note like you are a student, which is a little cute, I hope. And then you reference those at the end of the session when you think about what you want to improve. And it can also go kind of further than that. There are some other kind of ways of progression, but the one that I really like is your thesis. So again, leaning into the academic side of things, a character, maybe over the course of the session, comes up with a question about how magic works, and they can create a thesis where basically they have the research question, and then over the next session or two, they have experiences where they explore it, they test it, and there's some narrative mechanics for this. And then at the end, they get to accomplish their thesis, and they get what's known as a modifier rune, which is like a or another type of rune they can shove into their spells to like further mix it up. So the example we have is like the modifier of filth. Now you can cast really grimy, dirty types of spells, which might have some kind of fun implications. And then that basically layers on this new way to mix up spell casting after you've gotten more familiar with the system.
Mm-hmm. Now, you'd also hinted at making shortcuts, making deals with dark powers. How exactly would that end up working, and what would the benefits and drawbacks that somebody would get from it?
Yeah, so I like the patron system a lot. It's a little bare bones, I'll admit, but essentially it's a way for a character to get access to one of those modifier runes, and in return, or rather, they get that benefit. And what they give to the patron is some sort of cost. Now, it's not something that like is going to constantly harm them, right? It's not like you're slowly dying. I mean, I guess it can be if you want. But it's more like you're occasionally called to do some things that might be inconvenient. So, for example, one of the patrons gives you the modifier rune gear, so you can make kind of more mechanical type contraptions and spells. But it's kind of expected that you occasionally start massive bonfires as an offering to essentially this god, and to let your creations wander free when you're done with them. So just kind of create some nice little narrative spins to add into what's happening. In terms of how you meet them, I think that's kind of up to the GM. So in one of the example sessions I was running, I had the players, and I believe this is an example in the book too, they ran into kind of like this garbage slime, which was fairly powerful. And basically, as they're defeating it, the slime offers them basically a patron contract saying, accept me into your body so that I may live, and I will grant you my power. And in return, help me find basically kind of like a new home and grow once again. That's kind of a nice narrative choice to players. Now, that player did not accept it, but I think that's kind of a fun way just to throw some more mixes into how you might cast.
Yeah, I could see that. When it comes to just the consequences, is it mostly in just a narrative effect, i.e., is it possible for someone to wipe?
Yeah, it's definitely possible for someone to wipe. I think this is kind of up to the GM. So the way I lay out kind of requirements or consequences is basically to always think about the narrative first and foremost. And basically, you get to adjust how much damage you want a player to take based off, what you think should happen in the story. So I think a good example is the same slime that my players were fighting. They realized it was weak to fire. And so I was like, okay, obviously the slime's going to be weak to fire, but the slime knows this. And so it starts emitting basically all of this combustible gas into the air, basically saying, if you try to burn me again, I'll blow everyone up. And the players didn't care, and they blew everything up. And so we then had this fun scene, which was them all having wiped, basically. And they all kind of woke up in the college hospital and were just like, now have this horrible consequence they have to spend the next many sessions dealing with. Now, I think that's mostly in the artistry of the GM. Obviously, we give a lot of guidelines on how to set up encounters and how you should assign consequences, but if you want to kill all your players, that's the GM's prerogative, I would say. I think it's nice to have consequences, but obviously, if you're not done playing the game, then maybe you try to keep them alive.
I can certainly get that. Now, with that in mind, what are you shooting for as far as a page count for the project? I know that there were some stretch goals that are going to expand that.
Yeah, so I thought it was going to be around 60, but I've been slowly doing more layouting work and, getting the book ready to be published, getting some more art in, filling that in. And I think we're probably going to hit, my guess is 90 pages as of right now. So that's like 6x9. So that's a fairly decently sized 6x9 book, which is, again, bigger than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. And as far as a release window, what would you be shooting for? Not a date per se, but a ballpark.
Yeah, so what we said in the Kickstarter is we were shooting to have things basically out to backers in May, and then released to the public short after. That's still the goal. Definitely, I'm currently on track to meet that goal, and obviously doing my best to meet it. Of course, there could be delays, right? So, it takes time for artists to get their art, and I want to make sure the art is quality first and foremost. So if artists have some life disruptions or if they just simply need more time, then in my mind, that's a good reason to, maybe delay a little bit, make sure the art's good, make sure the artists could still have some semblance of nice balance in their lives. A month delay or something is not worth, or preventing that is not worth forcing someone into too much crunch. So aiming for May. If it goes a little bit longer, it's simply because we're making sure the product is good, And honestly, I probably set a pretty ambitious target, so hoping to meet it. But if it goes a little longer, hopefully people are understanding of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can certainly get behind that, and I'll keep an eye out for how the project develops. But
I appreciate that.
With that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple. And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged.
Thank you for having me. I would love to come back at a future time, and I suppose after this I should take that encouragement for the rest of the night.
Yeah. And it is a cold night.
That is true.
And of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.